Well, hey there, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host. And today I have a couple of participants that are jumping into the waters of The Sacred Speaks. Annie Lamott and Neal Allen, a lovely married couple who, on their own, are heavy hitters. And I'd like to read their bio, and then we'll jump into a couple of updates on The Sacred Speaks. We'll get started. Annie Lamott is the author of 20 books, including New York Times bestsellers Help, Thanks, Wow, Dusk, Night, Dawn, Traveling Mercies, and Bird by Bird, as well as 7 novels. A recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and an inductee to the California Hall of Fame. And her husband, Neal Allen, is a spiritual coach, workshop leader, and author who began his transformative journey about 10 years ago. Bob Birnbaum introduced him to teachings of notable figures like Fritz Perls, Carl Rogers, and Adyashanti, as well as spiritual practices such as Eckhart Tolle's Neo-Buddhism and Hamid Ali's Diamond Approach. His exploration deepened into self-realization, guiding him through the phases of shedding personal narratives and societal beliefs, embracing the absurd, and confronting the concept of death, which including volunteering at hospice and dealing with personal loss. These experiences have profoundly shaped his practice and writings, including his books, Shapes of Truth, Discover God Inside You, and Better Days, Tame Your Inner Critic. So today I talk with Neal about Better Days, Taming Your Inner Critic, and talk with Annie about somehow her newest book. Happy birthday, Annie. By the way, this week is Annie's birthday. And they introduced each other's books, so I'll let them certainly do that very soon. I stumbled into Annie because of an event that the Jung Center here in Houston was hosting, and I had the privilege of interviewing Annie. And we quickly realized that we were fond of each other, and then, of course, this interview manifested, and you'll see we had a great experience. And thank you, Annie. Thank you, Neal, for your time. You two have really broadened and expanded my life, certainly. And both of these books were beautiful to read at the same time. So go get the books, listen to them. Love and Taming the Inner Critic. These are great subject matters. And the cool thing about this conversation is we get to see how both of these radical ideas of love and the inner critic inform their marriage and inform their conversation. And what you'll find, I imagine, is certainly what I found, is a modeling, a beautiful modeling of how to be in the gunk. And I think Annie certainly does that well. She reminds us all how to be bravely, courageously open and raw. And that plays out in their marriage. So I'll let them speak for themselves. But I want to direct your attention to a couple of things. Of course, I mentioned the Jung Center. Check out the Jung Center at junghouston.org. A lot of great classes, online opportunities, and certainly if you're in Houston, come check us out. I'm involved. I'm on the board at the Jung Center. The other thing is, of course, the music. Hang out to the end of the episode. Check out Modern Nations, modernnationsmusic.com. Great song called Clouds. Of course, look at the Sacred Speaks website. Plenty of conversations over the past 6.5 years there to mine through. I've been doing other things for the past couple of months, so I've been a bit silent here. But I've got about 6 or 7 conversations coming up pretty soon. Look forward to Ross Ellenhorn, Greg Wren, Pete Holmes, and Barry Taylor are going to be on. A number of others. Thank you very much for tuning in, and please share it. Okay, so Jung Center, The Sacred Speaks at the website, and check out the Center for Healing Arts and Sciences, a boutique integrative wellness practice that we've been working in for years. My wife and I are the founders. We're also creating a spiritual community online called Narmati, Narmotti. Go to the website at the center and check that out. We're going to have on, I think, a monthly rotation, about 14 groups that we're offering online that range from relationship to money to, we're calling them sacred relationships, sacred money, sacred masculine, sacred feminine, so on and so forth, sacred spiritual practice. There's a lot of clinicians that are participating in this project, and the idea is that we will help people congregate around the ways that they suffer, not any central text or ethos. It's exciting to begin to release that, and of course, the Sacred Speaks is part of that. And there will be a group that I'll be hosting every other week about the Sacred Speaks and what would be happening and kind of behind the scenes. So check out Narmati, and you'll gain access to a group that I'll be hosting for the Sacred Speaks. I think that's it. Oh yeah, the video quality on the interview is not great. The audio is fantastic, but it all comes through. So pardon the technical difficulty, but the show must go on. Hang out for the second part of the show where we dig into my inner critic and do some experiential work. I think this is exciting. I'm glad Neal took me on the ride, and it was transformative. So thank you, Neal. And again, thank you, Annie. Thank you, Neal. Appreciate your time. Lots of love. Happy birthday and happy releasing of this book, Annie. It's a wonderful contribution to culture to explore something so meaningful like love. So for now, we'll leave it there. Thanks for joining. Annie and Neal, it's a pleasure to arrange the time. I'm eager to not only, of course, chat with you both individually about your work, but also see how this collaborative connection, because I know that you two are doing a lot together in your tours and your work. But first, I mean, whoever can begin, I am interested in your collaboration. And I'm also interested in you both introducing these books. Annie, I know your book is about to come out. When's the release date? Is it soon?
April 9th.
9th,
April
coming out
9th.
next week.
Yeah.
Good.
Why
And
don't I
Neal,
introduce Neal's book?
good.
Okay,
I love
good.
it.
Neal's book came out at the very beginning of December, and we hit the road, Jack, and then we came back and we went to 8 or 9 cities, and he shared this work he's been doing for years with people that he's developed on identifying the inner critic inside of you.
Yeah.
So that has been telling you who you are.
Yes.
And really how disappointed it is in you and how much better you could be doing. And P.S., for God's sake, don't even try that, because you will almost certainly blow it or make a fool of yourself publicly and bring down the entire family. And we met, we're 7, almost 3/4 years ago. I'm coming up on it. And we did this on our second date. The work he does, that I'm sure he'll do with you at some point during this podcast. And I was never the same, because I just thought this voice, which I had been hearing my entire life, knew some things that I should pay attention to, that I shouldn't spread my wings too wide, and that I could do better. But little by little in this book, he teaches you how this voice, he calls the inner critic, Freud called it the superego, kept us alive when we were little ones, because it helped us not run out into the street or swim out too far. But really at 50 and 60 and 70, we're very good with traffic safety and with knowing how much surf we can handle, if any. And so there's a process he does, and the book is about that process. It's called Better Days, Tame Your Inner Critic, and it's about learning to hear it, and to thank it and to release it, to maybe go read somewhere while you get this day's writing done. So that's what Better Days is about.
Awesome. And Neal, why don't you do the same thing? I know you've been involved in Annie's new book.
So Annie's book is her 20th book, coming out on her 70th birthday. And I just figured out that her first book came out, which was a novel that was kind of focused on her father's death, and she wrote it when she was in her 20s. And 44 years ago, 43 or 44 years ago.
I think 46 years ago. I was 26 when it came out. So yeah. 44 years ago.
44. So she's done a book every 2 years and 2 months, right? I think I figured out something like that. Maybe 2 years and 4 months. But at any rate, 2 years and 2 months. She writes about, it's interesting, her first book was about her father's cancer, and it was written during a time when you didn't talk about cancer. Mm. Cancer was a hidden thing in families, and a lot of the book was about her father and she and her brothers dealing with the fact that he had cancer, brain cancer, and you didn't talk about it. It was shameful to talk about. And then she did other books that were about things people don't talk about. She did a book called, a lot of people have read, called Bird by Bird, which is about the hard side of writing, not the, oh, let's go publish our book side, but, oh, let's deal with, as she puts it, KFKD radio, K-fucked radio.
Which is the inner critic.
Which is the inner critic, and how to deal with the fact that none of your family will like the fact that you're writing about them or near them, or even that you're a writer, and about things like that. And then she did operating instructions, which was a kind of a diary of having her child Sam, and it was about everything nobody writes about, like the night that she just felt like taking him after he was colicky and taking him and leaving him on a basket on the front porch.
Very carefully wrapped up.
Yeah, yeah.
Safety first. Safety first.
Safety first.
And so it was kind of the first book about the reality of having a child. And her other books are about, so if she's writing about love, she's writing about the reality of love. Not about what we want love to be, not about what other people have said it is, not kind of coming up with a nice, clean definition of love, but how love is difficult, and love requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is difficult for human beings. Mm-hmm. And we were lucky. We met late in life. And so we met at a time when we had both become, in our 60s, we had both become persuaded, I suppose, that we enjoyed being in life as vulnerable people rather than defended people. And so when we met each other's vulnerabilities openly. And right from the get-go, in our first 2 weeks together, in the kind of soda fountain dating period that we had, we were just blurting out the things that we were ashamed of to ensure that we could be vulnerable to each other. And that's kind of been a mark of our friendship and our love.
You forgot to tell them the title and the subtitle.
The title is Somehow Thoughts on Love.
Yeah. What's so interesting about you two is, because I had the privilege of reading these two books around the same time. You know, I intermingled them a little bit intentionally. And Annie, you're certainly, you know, I love your writing, and I think many people would agree, because you speak so openly about your inner monologue and dialogues. And fascinatingly enough, Neal, you're writing about the inner critic that Annie's exposing to the world, and does so wonderfully. And everybody gets all excited because they feel empowered to be able to share, like, oh my gosh, somebody can share that publicly? Well, you know, but I spent a lot of time in Buddhist texts and in psychology. And Neal, I do have to say, also in your department, I don't know that I've read a book that has inspired me so much regarding this confrontation with the inner critic, and that I can, as a clinician, implement so quickly with the people that I work with. So both of you two do this amazing service for the parts of us that we tend not to even want to share with ourselves, much less anybody else.
Yeah,
so thank you.
Yeah, it's right. It's just immediate. It's like you read, 25 pages, and you all of a sudden have this tool that works 100% of the time to dismiss it, and to understand, also to have a depth of compassion for yourself, because it helps you remember how scared you were, how unwell your parents might have been, and how this voice that criticized you and shamed you and kept you really small was a really misguided effort of something inside you to help you stay afloat in the hardship of being a little kid with parents who possibly weren't very well. It bred for me such compassion for that little one, of, oh my God, if I hadn't had that voice that told me I could do a lot better, or had just blown it, I wouldn't have always had consistent company, but at this age, I know I know where I blow it. I know where I make mistakes. Sometimes I make them on stage, sometimes I make them in print. And so I don't need any more voices telling me that I should stay afraid and small, because I need voices like Neal's voice as my partner is to go big, is to just shoot the moon. Because I was really afraid writing the love book, because I felt like, the inner critic who visits me every day, but I have a tool now to work with it. But it would visit me and say, boy, I think you've written all this stuff somewhere else, and talk about beating a dead horse. And oh my God, the New York City literary world is not going to be thrilled about a little aging hippie California book about love. And then Neal would say, well, I would be, and he's East Coast and he's overeducated.
St. John's, I read that, Neal. That's a good institution.
It was it has everything to do with who I am. It had as much force in my life as my parents did, because it taught me that understanding books means diving into them as if they've already proved themselves. That you don't read a book at St. John's in order to decide whether you like it. You read a book at St. John's in order to figure out what the hell it means, and to stick with it and to assume it means something and then stay with it. And that ended up being a better way through life than being prejudicial. And it kind of erases certain kinds of prejudicial bents to the mind. The mind wants to prejudge things. The inner critic wants you to be extraordinarily conservative, extraordinarily conformist, and it urges you to take on the cultural artifacts that are temporary and that are, for instance, right now, it urges me to care more about people's identities than about who they are. And everything in my training says, whether it's Buddhist or St. John's or my life, says that's the least interesting thing about people. And, their racial identity, their religious identity, their political identity, those sorts of identities, while they seem to be paramount to people right now, are mostly defensive identities that prevent, keep people out, keep people in, form these tiny little tribes, and then lead to frustration and anger and all the defensive postures that people have.
Well, that's a bit of a setup, because Annie, you were pretty open about this canceling that you experienced regarding transphobia, and how you've been caught up in that system of what we call cancel culture, and the fears about identity, and what happens if somebody kind of just throws a soundbite at you, and the devastation it can have just interpersonally and intrapersonally. And so it's interesting that you two are both involved in this, because Neal, one of the questions I have to ask of you later on is about this exact dynamic with the polarizing of our identity politics. Would you all talk about that? I mean, I'll just throw a lobbed ball out there to see what happens.
And it's so dangerous to talk about because people have such strict ideas about it at this point. And that's very strange. It's very temporary, I would assume. I was talking to a German woman I encountered while I was traveling, and she was in her late 20s, and she had lived in Ohio for 2 years and came back, and I asked her what she noticed, and she said, well, in Germany, we learn that there are rules, and the rules change to how you talk about certain things, how you name things, how you are careful not to hurt people's feelings in certain ways. And if you stumble or break a so-called rule, the expectation isn't that you will absorb that rule and take it on for yourself. The expectation is you'll be polite to the person for whom that rule matters. And then in the rest of your life, you can decide whether that rule matters for you. And that allows for mistakes, right? And it allows for people not to be offended as easily as they are in the United States.
Yeah.
So people are very, very tied to their hurt feelings in the United States. And I think in general, people are getting more and more tied to their hurt feelings. And that's an odd thing, because if you really notice hurt feelings, everybody's hurting everybody's feelings all the time. It isn't actually a huge deal if you notice that people apologize when they notice that they've hurt somebody's feelings.
I don't really have much to add to that. My feelings are quite easily hurt, and sometimes I do need to point out to Neal that he's hurt my feelings. And then, but the murmur underneath that is the extreme hyper sensitivity to people, what people are going to do is to comment on you and your life and your work. And Neal, I have a lot of rigidity. I have OCD, and I like things to be sort of organized in a certain way and to be the same. And so in my system, the system currently in place, if something is said outside of that lane, it's really devastating to me. So that's just normal human interaction, right? That somebody says something that really gets under my skin and hurts my feelings, and I cry often, or I get blinky. But then there's this other thing with the cancel culture where I had said, or I had retweeted something a friend said 10 years ago that was horrible, 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 transphobic, which I am not a transphobic woman. Right. And if you've read my decades and decades of work, it's really very clear where my heart lies, and the extreme warmth and openness and acceptance in my heart. But it just went viral. And this thing happened that I'm not positive I had experienced before, where I ended up feeling like the movie Frankenstein with the villagers with their torches at the door. And that I was, and I dealt with it, and I, of course, undid it as much as I could, but it was out there. I've written twice about it, about the mortification I felt and the pain I caused my son and the pain I caused so many people, and the grace that flowed from that wound and the healing and the whatnot. And you know what? I think this side of the grave, people are going to still be muttering about it, because I got canceled recently. I got canceled by Taylor Swift's fans because I rather innocently, I thought, on New Year's Eve, said I was looking forward to 2024 because I thought maybe there'd be a little less coverage of Taylor Swift. Now, I admire Taylor Swift. I'm not positive I've ever heard her, but I admire her, and she's gangbusters, and I think she'll help the liberals do really well in November. But at that point, I knew what her boyfriend's cousin had gotten her for Christmas, because that was the level of saturation. Well, the next thing I knew, I was in every single major news site in the country for being anti-woman, being jealous of a beautiful young woman who is infinitely more talented and wealthy than I'll ever be, which is absolutely true. And it happened literally in a blink. And what could I say except for, what did I say? I think I said,
sorry.
I'm so sorry, but I didn't want, in politics, they say if you're explaining, you're losing. So I didn't want to explain that I did happen to know what some of her boyfriend's relatives had worn at her most recent concert, and I didn't explain. I just did what you do. I hung my head and I said, I'm really sorry. And it didn't end there, and when I'm on this book tour for the new book, it's going to come up. Because I got canceled by tens of thousands of Taylor Swift fans. I got into Vanity Fair for the first time in my life.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. An honor.
Wow. I can hear it. I can feel it, just noticing my own anxiety as we're talking about this. It's like, Because there's something about us being social beings, and that we have all these
Yeah.
receptors and like little feelers out there that we know what it feels like to be embarrassed or rejected
Yeah.
or criticized, and so when we operate in the mass, that's hugely difficult for somebody. So I
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
I can imagine it's been a tough ride with the Swifties coming out and
The
um
Swifties got me. The Swifties got the princess. But I also want to say back to when we first met, it was so funny because we sat down. I am very shy and introverted, and I don't have meals with people that I don't know. I also have an eating disorder, so I just really like to be on the couch with the animals and the 10 foods I like and
mhm.
are really safe to me. And so I agreed to meet Neal for coffee. We lived about 13 minutes apart. We met halfway and we sat down for coffee, and we immediately just grokked each other. We just got it. That any movie I had loved so much that I'd seen it twice, and again recently, he had seen twice and a couple years ago. And any book that we had read over and over again and been major books that we foisted on people, young and old, were the exact same books. The difference is that he can remember the plots, and I don't remember what I read last night. But anyway, we just started jamming. And for anyone who's hoping to find a partner, for me, I had two values that Neal had like four, and one, I mean, they were superficial if you ask me. One was that he wanted the person to be pretty, whereas I didn't care. But I wanted to find someone who I felt like I could talk to for the rest of my life,
Wow.
whose breadth of interest was spiritual, political, who was a seeker, who was plugged in, who followed the news, who cared about family, who was passionate about the poor. And the second and I knew we could talk forever. We hadn't even gotten to the other 100 books that we had in common. The other thing was I'd always been with men that might show off well, um, and be charming and whatever. But I always secretly knew that if they had been a woman, they wouldn't be my best girlfriend. That they were fine for the guy I was with for a few years or whatever. And I felt with Neal that even if Neal was a woman, I'd want him to be my best girlfriend. So, but anyway, oh,
What a
so
beautiful, yeah.
what I started to say is when we first met, um, we started talking about the stuff that we're talking about today with you, John.
Mhm.
And we just started sharing these funny little stories that we were so ashamed of. And then for the next 2 weeks in the soda shop stage, we'd be watching one of our Scandinavian detective thrillers on which we have been tragically hooked for 7.5 years. And one of us would pause it and say, you know what, I want to tell you something, because if we're going to keep the conversation going, I want you to know I did this. I've done this. I used to do this. I don't anymore. This one thing happened to me once that plagues me, and it's going to come up if we stick together. And then we'd turn our show back on.
We
And
wouldn't discuss it.
yeah,
You would take a turn and say something
yeah,
shameful, and then half an hour later, I'd hit pause and say something shameful,
yeah,
and we never discussed it. I mean, later in life, we
yeah,
on
yeah.
occasion discussed those.
Not
Liberating.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, but usually it made a big difference. It turns out that you can have a relationship without secrets, and that a
Mm.
relationship without secrets creates fewer problems, right?
yeah, definitely.
Well, but what most people do is they get concerned about a reaction, and it sounds
Yeah,
like you two are both in it, and there there's no overwhelming reaction because you meet each other in a way that's accepting.
I think that's right.
Yeah,
I think it's kind of um we would neither of us both of us have lived long enough. We would never say, "Oh, you did that?
yeah,
Gross."
yeah,
We'd say, "Huh, yeah, I know
yeah,
about that one." Right.
yeah,
I tried that. Or even if Annie had done something just unthinkable, I would think to myself, well, that was then. What
mhm,
we do is our superpower isn't making good decisions.
right.
We make good
Mm.
decisions. Our superpower is adapting
Mm.
to things going sideways. And
Mhm.
we do things that go sideways and hurt somebody else's feelings horribly. And that's not a bad thing in the sense that 5 days later, I'm different and would never do that again. And that's the problem with cancel culture, is that it says, no, you're supposed to be perfect and you're not actually supposed to be given the chance to adapt and change.
Right.
And poor people, if you're not giving yourself the chance to adapt and change, then you're going to be stuck in a very, very rigid, strange life.
Mhm.
I mean, I always apply the parenting dynamic to that. I worked in a school for a while. I was a counselor in a school. And if we operated by saying to any child, if you made a mistake, we kick you out of the school, we'd be empty. You know, like
Right.
who in their right mind would actually lead a community of developing, growing human beings in this way? Yet in mass, we have this
Right.
reduction of how we approach people. It's horrible.
Well, the problem, though, is that God does that in Genesis, right? So
Nick,
he
you're
tells
Nick. You're out.
he tells this couple of like really young people who are just learning how to experience the world, oh, don't eat that apple, and they do exactly what every 2-year-old, and they're basically 2-year-olds would do. They pick up the apple and they lick it and they eat it, and then he kicks them out of Eden forever. That's a huge overreaction, right?
Yes.
We base our religions.
Yeah.
That, as usual, there are two origin stories. There's a beautiful origin story where everything's good, and that's true nature. And then there's the second origin story where humans start to screw things up and it all goes south. And so they have to live in this purgatory forever. And that whole bad seed idea is maintained through our culture.
Wait.
And so you didn't make a mistake, you're bad, right? You didn't say the wrong thing ignorantly, you're bad. That's what we're being taught.
Yeah.
And it's an old story, and it's quite easy to run a country that way, right? It's quite easy to run a culture that way.
Oh,
Right? Everybody becomes more and more obedient.
I can stop a behavior by shaming the shit out of a child. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just doesn't do well for my relationship with that child and trust.
No.
Without so I've got this thing written here. This is great, y'all. I love how I haven't even gotten to a single question, which is quite beautiful, actually. So I've got this written at the top: love and the inner critic. And I'm thinking about, when we write a book, we tend to be in like, it takes a lot of real estate, emotional, mental, psychological, spiritual real estate, and we want to invest ourselves in the subject. And so, why love? Why the inner critic? And also, why together?
Yeah. Well, my default isn't psychology or counseling or even coaching. I stumbled into coaching late in life. My default's always been writing. So I was a journalist for 15 years, and I was got into corporate work through public relations, eventually got out of that and worked for big public corporations in more program management. But my default was always writing. And so I've always thought of myself as having a mastery in writing, and that's my groove in life. And so I write only about things that, not only, but I write either for other people or about things that appear in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's just subject matter, right? There's nothing special about my subject matter. There's nothing special about writing about the inner critic. It happens that the inner critic, work on the inner critic developed into my practice with coaching clients. And all of a sudden one day I noticed, wow, I am seeing some universals in here that I don't think have been out there in the world, that are fairly mechanical and fairly simple to describe, and that are kind of surprising. And so I wrote a book about that, because that's what I do. I write books, right? Or I write articles, or I write this, or I was a hack writer. I wasn't like Annie, a star writer, but I've always written about what's going on in my life. That happened to be what was going on in my life, and it was some of the easiest stuff for me ever to write, because I knew the material so well from hundreds of clients and workshop clients and private clients who had gone through this funny experience that I stumbled on, and then I took them through to meet and then entertain a relationship directly with their inner critic. The first thing that the book points out is that you've probably thought that you're talking to yourself, and you're not. It's a parasite.
That's right.
And by the way, speaking of cancer culture, I get trolled by the IFS, internal family systems people, sometimes because their system is based on a concept called no bad parts. And their system is beautiful. Dick Schwartz's system is beautiful and absolutely works, and nobody should think it's in any way in competition with what I'm writing about. What I'm writing about is it shares a lot of components with Dick Schwartz's system, but it is in that one way contradictory. It does say it's a parasite, it's a bad part, it used up its usefulness. And there are ways that I can rejigger it and move it into Dick Schwartz's system or whatever, but it actually stands alone perfectly well. And it's weird how immediate the understanding of what the inner critic is when you do this simple exercise. It's just very weird. I watch it over and over again, and I'm just kind of so tickled because, oh, wait, that's what it is kind of the response.
Yeah, I've been having insights reading your book, Neal. It's going to be a staple in my practice, without a doubt. Annie, what do you say?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the question was.
Love. Why love?
Why love? Well, because I was feeling an unusual amount of anxiety about my son and grandson's future a couple years ago, and that I think the UN climate change reports gave us 12 years to turn it around radically about 5 years ago, 4 years ago. And of course, nothing has happened. And but then I started to think about leaving them a owner's manual, like bird by bird, or operating instructions, or help, thanks, wow. That was every single thing I knew that had ever worked before during really bleak, scary times when the future's been really bad, having to go on without somebody you can't live without, or say the Bush Cheney years that I had a tiny problem with, or whatever. And so I started writing these pieces about what has always worked and what surely will again when I'm gone. And every single thing I wrote had somehow to do with one realm of love or another. So it started to be kind of accidentally, we started thinking of it as the love book. And I mean, there's no word more misused. There's no sappier, more Hallmark card, kind of repellent word and phrases and bumper stickers than there are about love. And I thought, yeah, well, that's true. Yet at the same time, I wonder if anybody's ever noticed this or that. I wonder if anyone's ever really written about the how community functions as medicine, or how nature is God. Good, the great outdoors is an acronym for how nature is, so above, so below, as outside, as inside, all one thing. And nature is the healer. Right. I mean, I know people have written about this for thousands of years, but I hadn't. And I started writing these pieces when you're completely lost and it's all hopeless. Go outside and look up, look at the stars, or the book starts out with Neal's insistence that everything that is true and beautiful can be experienced on a 10-minute walk. That's how the book starts out. And everything.
Great quote.
It is. Everything in the book somehow references that. So I can say to my son and grandson, when I'm gone and you're completely lost and scared to death because of the climate or the politics, go outside, grab yourself by your own wrist and drag yourself outside and stay outside for a few minutes, or go walk down to the 7-Eleven for a creamsicle, but get outside. So that's how I came to write this book on love. I didn't set out to.
To me, you're so one beautiful aspect of the way that you write is it's a revelation. You're spending your time revealing, and the act of your revealing it certainly it certainly helps me as a reader love you and
Thank you.
enjoy the experience because it's ironic that it's so courageous, Annie. Like how odd. Here I am talking to both of you. Neal, you're writing this amazing book on the inner critic. Annie, you are like totally exposing your inner critic and to reveal and what happens is people just fall right in line and go, oh my gosh, I'm empowered by this person because she's saying the things that I know exist inside of me, but I don't share. And she's taking the risk and sharing it. And Neal, you're almost providing a pathway to engage with those voices that show up for us that prevent us from sharing what Annie, you're so um, elegantly revealing. That may not be the right word, but opening the audience
Thank
to.
you.
Yeah.
You know, we're always, everybody's constantly trying to improve their lot, and they're looking for kind of bliss states essentially. And the fact is, you don't learn a damn thing from bliss states. Are fun, but you don't learn anything from them. You actually learn everything about adaptability and freedom and ease from suffering, right?
Yeah.
And so I think in a certain way, we're both doing that. And I tell my clients, I'm here to torture you. I want to bring you through things. And it's the Fisher King story. It's the story that asking the question, what ails you, and listening to the answer and not offering advice will lead you somewhere, right? And will lead the suffering out, that we complain in order to rid ourselves of the complaint. And nothing in our culture tells us to do that. Everything in our culture tells us don't complain, be stoic, be strong, be better, just keep moving, right? Good, waiting for Godot, just keep right. And we're in a kind of niche that's saying, wait a minute, we want to hear your suffering. We want to talk about our suffering, not because we're like masochists, but because mostly it's the easiest way into freedom, right? Most of freedom is just destroying the defensive armor, and the defensive armor is what gives us the suffering.
You got anything, Annie?
No.
I wanted to bring up what you and I were saying when you were in Houston, because I've now heard you quote Duncan Trussell several times, and you mentioned armor, Neal, of course, and saying, you know, here you're meeting everybody's armor, and so I'm wondering about earlier, Neal, you certainly write about hurt feelings in a beautiful way. You mentioned it earlier, and Annie, then you say, hey, my feelings are hurt all the time. So would y'all talk about how you work through? If I could take advantage of the fact that you're both here, how in your marriage, how you work through hurt feelings and how your vulnerability and your awareness of inner critics might hinder, but also help you navigate the complexity of interpersonal dynamics in a romantic relationship.
Well, I'm glad to talk about that. My feelings aren't hurt all that often, but when they are, I take it really personally. And there's an acronym in recovery, which is Q-tip, quit taking it personally. And I'd say I'm quite a lot better, but things still just really hurt me. I'm very sensitive. That's why I can write some of the things I've written, is because I really feel things. But like the other night, Friday night, Neal and I got into it a little bit, and we were really just off with each other. And usually what I do is I cry, and Neal gets up and stomps around, and then I leave and I get very quiet and I weaponize my silence. You can read about it in my book and somehow. And then
and in my book.
And in his book, and then in both books, and all future books.
Yeah.
And we both, you know, the Buddhists would say, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And I want to be happy, but I know I'm right. And I know Neal is a know-it-all, so he knows he's right too. So you come up to this place of clenched fists, you know, and this time it was something, it's been with us the whole 7 years. It came up again. And I cried and he stomped. And then then he came back, and I wanted to drag out the old tired briefs, you know, from the battered briefcase and explain where I stood and what was true. And instead, we were in the dark by then. I had turned off the lights. It was very late. And in the dark, I all of a sudden it was like the Holy Spirit nudge or something. And I just moved up against him and draped an arm over his shoulder, and my hand was sort of dangling on him. And there was nothing for a moment. And then he took my hand. And then no matter what, I knew in the morning we would have a completely different morning than we would have had otherwise.
Yeah.
And then it was like 80% better. And then we had to go to the dump because we had a huge amount of cardboard recycling. And so I said, want to come with, and that's normally. And I think for a lot of people, you hang on to it. I'm still a little hurt. We're better, but I'm going to go do my errands and my things. So I said, want to come with? And he said, yeah. And so we went, and I thought we were just having a kind of, post-trauma warmth or friendliness. And all of a sudden Neal said, well, as long as I've got you. And he brought it up, and we had like half an hour, and I cried. And it was surprising information to me, and it hurt my feelings, or it embarrassed me that I'm that way. And we understood almost instantly, within an hour, that it had taken us to a place that was so deep and loving that we couldn't have gotten to this new place of depth and love
and
trust without what we've been through 24 hours before.
Yeah.
So that's my description of what it's like.
There's a benefit to not getting mad at myself or blaming myself for getting into a conflict, right? I mean, it's going to happen. I'm going to get triggered. The tape will run. Even if now I've got an authentic self open that's watching the tape run, going, "What the heck's that going? It's still going,
Oh,
And that's nice, but you can't stop it. But I do have a responsibility after the tape is quit running and the trance of the conflict is over, and it might be the next day, or if it's a small thing, might be 5 minutes later, to just stop and go, what was that? What was that? Objectively, what was that? Okay, I saw the tape run, and that means I know that tape. That tape is related to this defensive structure in me. I mean, I can get all analytic about it, but it also means I can go and say, hey, that tape ran. And Annie will say, oh yeah, my tape ran this way. And we're like, huh. And then all of a sudden we're kind of saying, yeah, we've still got that stuff left in us from childhood or later or whatever, and we're going to react to each other every once in a while. And then the good thing is that we're old enough that it happens seldom enough that we don't have to do a lot of work. Right.
Right.
If something came up where we were like getting into a fight every week or even every month, we'd have to think about doing some work. But as it is, something like this happens every 6 months or so, would you say? Maybe
a little bit more than that.
Maybe a little more. Okay.
Well, thanks for your mentorship here. I'm in my 40s and I'm still fiery, so I still have some work to do.
Well, I mean, everything in me goes in one of the default places of my early childhood, or my first 10 years, was this victimized self-righteousness, because I'm a pretty innocent person, and I'm trying to be super conscious of my effect on people, because I'm a little, I'm a little tense and rigid, or I'm just set in my ways, and so I watch myself now. It's one of the gifts of watching for the inner critic, is just watching for which of the default lily pads I'm going to go to that are home, that mean mom and dad might be nearby, and they've wildly fallen in love with each other, and they've gotten a lot of help, and dad now sees mom as an equal, and they're both, and mom's in a women's group, and but so I try to recreate home with this feeling of victimized self-righteousness, and boy, it didn't work then. It's just not working a lot better at 70, and I felt that on Friday night. I felt that, like, you misunderstood me, you this, you that, but I have the awareness. I'm gonna, this side of the grave, I'm gonna keep going back to a couple of these lily pads. They're like toxic comfort zones for me, where mom and dad might show up and don't, but and are dead, but they never really die. But the thing is that one of the great blessings and graces of being older is that you go to these old places, and instead of it being weeks, or in my case, my entire 20s, it could be a few hours, and the willingness, we talked about this in Texas, the willingness comes from the pain.
Yeah.
So when you created enough inner pain for yourself by being so toxic to someone else and feeling so awful about yourself, like you're disgusting somehow or repellent, do the work. What's this about? Neal's often an innocent bystander in the old Lamott family drama, of mom and dad being so miserable and dad being really tall and in charge of all of life, and it was just the 50s. And I'm going to be an innocent bystander in the old Allen family script. It just is going to happen as long as we're here. But I think I might have said this in Texas, but my priest friend, Father Terry Ritchie, said years ago, decades ago, he said, the point isn't to try harder, it's to resist less. And so I don't try a new angle expressing this same old script to Neal. It's like, stop and lie in the dark and breathe and hold on to the kitty. Neal will come back and we will know what to do. Take a breath and reach for him, and that's new behavior.
We're all of that, and we're supported by just this continual, I mean, this sounds like gloating or something. It's just a fact that I just feel really lucky. We ran into each other because we can talk about a lot of the same things. We have different interests, but we converge, oddly enough, on the most important stuff. So we're both interested in what people generally kind of collapse into the ineffable, right? And say it's ineffable. And we're like, no, we're interested in articulating that stuff. That's the hard stuff to articulate. And it's fascinating when we succeed, right? Or feel that we've succeeded. And so when I'm writing a book, if I get stuck on some big term like gratitude or love or happiness, and I'll realize, wow, I wrote that word and boy, I don't know what that means. And I've got to figure that out before I write the next sentence. I can go into Annie and say, tell me about gratitude. And the next thing we're off and running.
We'll talk for an hour I will say, Neal, can you come in and work on something? He'll come in and I'll say, talk to me about spirit. Talk to me about why when people are terminally ill, they get to experience something that we don't otherwise. How many layers people get to take off when they are no longer trying to impress anyone or achieve much, how they're trying to live here, how they're trying to be here, how they have stopped thinking about what they achieved or what they've squandered, but they're instead thinking about their love history, and the love that is surrounding them and holding them up and lying in bed beside them or making them laugh or crying with them. And we'll talk we'll just jam like we did on those first dates for 45 minutes. Now, what I do is I scribble everything down because I'm absent-minded. But we can have these talks, and that has really made the difference. Like even in the car, I'm going to the dump to recycle the cardboard boxes on Saturday. I thought, can I risk bringing up this thing because it made me teary, and it was me at my absolutely most vulnerable, and where a shadowy thing was showing, maybe a jealousy or maybe a competitive thing or something like that. And can I risk bringing it up? Well, I have this trust that if I just blurt out those first few words, I can't get that toothpaste back in the tube, and I'm going to say them, and they're going to be out there, and it may not be ideal. It may be exactly what he would love not to hear, but that somehow, because grace bats last, it's going to be okay, and it will help us to know each other and ourselves, and have more respect for ourselves for that courage. The courage it takes both to, I remember Frederick Bartholomew, who's before your time, but not ours, was a very experimental short story writer in the New Yorker in the 60s and late 70s. And he wrote this one short story, and he just said this simple line. He said, an apple is hard thing to throw or to catch. And I just got it. You know, that the truth is a hard thing to throw and it's a hard thing to catch. And it doesn't, you don't throw or catch it and feel this sense of bliss of, oh my God, I told, you know, you feel miserable and kind of, you get a stomach ache and you feel like you hold your breath a little bit, but you've caught it or he's caught it and you threw it and they caught it and here you are. And then once you're here, you are, wow. You sit there together, you're committed to somehow finding your way through this. And like we got our miracle, it was kind of an uncomfortable miracle. And now there's nothing I wouldn't have paid for us to have gone through that 24 hours together.
The way we're good at giving each other the benefit of the doubt, and doubt has a particular meaning to us. So that, you know, Annie taught me, is that Tillich, the quote, that the opposite of faith isn't
Doubt.
Doubt, it's certainty.
Yeah.
Right.
It's Tillich, yeah.
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 So would you talk about benefit of the doubt with each other? What do you mean?
I mean that if Annie's going to tell me that, and we're not in a conflict about something she doesn't like about me, right? I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt that she's right not to like that about me. And that I have the opportunity to, she gives me some, because she does the same thing. We give each other the opportunity to test out the possibility that we don't have to defend ourselves from anything the other one says. And that's scary and miserable in a certain way. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't, when she tells me something she doesn't like about me, it doesn't sting. Yeah. It'll sting. And then, but I also give her the benefit of the doubt and can come back to it. And that prevents what the Buddhists talk about as the second dart or the second arrow, right? That prevents me from re-stinging myself by deciding that, no, that was a hurt feeling that deserves to be maintained by me and that I deserve to continue to defend myself from.
Yeah. I'm not as good at it as Neal is. I don't always give him the benefit of the doubt. I brood over it and try to decide whether I need a lawyer. But for instance, I can give you a kind of a umbrella tool I have, which was that in our early days. So since we got together, we've never not been together that day unless one of us has had to travel out of town without the other. It's about maybe not even 6 months in, 3 or 4 months in, my son, who had always had me at his beck and call, I was a single mother and I had a lot of codependence and guilt and that, and he had always sort of had me there to be his like assistant. And he sometimes could be kind of, I don't know if you can say asshole on your show, but he could be kind of an asshole to the men I was with. And he had been acting like it was very clear Neal and I were in it to win it. And he had said something or very dismissive. And the day before, and we were walking along and Neal brought it up, and he brought it up in a way that I thought was really harsh. It was possibly true, but to me it rang ugly. And I felt like, oh my God, this is a kid who had at the time 6 years clean and sober, who was just finding himself, who had been a father at 19 and all that. It was so misunderstanding, Sam, that I dropped his hand. We were walking on hand in hand, and I said, I don't know how we can go on after that. And I really meant it. I mean, if there was that deep a chasm, I didn't know how we could ever reach across it for each other again. And then his thing is to try to, put his arm around you. I said, I don't want to be, I don't want to be touched. And it's sort of like my inner Donald Trump comes out, and I become a little bombastic, and I shut down, and I had to be alone then. That's another thing I do. And so he went off he was living at a house 15 minutes away, and he wrote to me and he said, let me try and make this right. And I wrote about it several books ago. And he made it so right.
Mm.
He made it so profoundly right. He didn't fix anything. He didn't give me advice. He didn't ask. He didn't beg. He just said, let me make this right. Because it was a misunderstanding. It was a total misunderstanding.
Mm.
And it was like a new people in the family. Like I'd been with Sam and Jax, my grandson, forever. And then Neil comes in, and it's hard, it's hard in the beginning. It was so interesting. So there've been a number of times over the years where whether or not we say it out loud, the position is, let me make this right. And that's something that there's something to be said for being married, which I didn't know, which is that when you decide to be married, you're deciding to give the person some grace and some leeway to slog and flail their way through it to you, and then to slog and flail and awkwardly and this and tearfully and all of it until the other has made it right. And I would say we've probably had to do that 5 times, which isn't a lot. And other times, like Friday night wasn't like, let me make this right. It was just like a very natural thing between a couple that something comes up and it really hurts or it's really off. It's been a long time coming. And so it's all juicy and fermented by the time it finally comes forth. But those other times, we've had this position and this opportunity, and it hasn't been a lovely opportunity where we have gotten to say that to the other, let me make this right, instead of the guillotine dropping on them, which is very tempting when you feel very misunderstood, or you're, especially if your children, or if somebody has misunderstood your children in a way that really gets to you, and I've always slammed the bank vault shut, and I don't with Neil, because I trust that no matter how messy and rashy and crunchy and uncomfortable it'll be, we will, as a unit, be able to make it right.
Mm.
Most relationships fail at the level of friendship. And what's distinctive about the love of friends, best friends I'm thinking of, is you're not annoying to that person, right? Your annoyances are acceptable to that person. And so best friends don't correct each other. And so we operate 98% of the time not correcting each other. And I can say that's not hard work, and that's true. And then when the urge comes, it's hard work to suppress it.
What do you mean by that? Correcting each other? How so?
So the way I picture it is kind of a back-assed way. I picture most things back-assedly, but I picture it so I'm a know-it-all, and I've always been, come from a family of know-it-alls. We have this narcissistic structure that just has to be right all the time, right? And I've done my work, so I'm at ease with myself in the world with that. But the way I picture myself is I'm in a cocktail party, and I'm talking to a group of people, and they're all getting annoyed at me because I'm talking over them and I'm being right and all of that. And my best friend is standing at the side laughing his head off, right? Because he knows exactly what they're going through. But for some reason, we're best friends because it just doesn't annoy him. It's just not a thing that annoys him. And I think Annie and I kind of operate that way, that we're best friends most of the time. And I'll watch Annie behaving and she'll watch me behaving, and there isn't something to correct there. We're quirky, we're oddballs in a lot of ways, and
we're very different.
We're very different.
We're very different. Yeah, Neil would go out 3 times a week to hear live music. And when I go out with him to hear live music, I often end up in tears because I feel like I'm a 6-year-old child and it's too loud. I hate loud noises, so I don't really want to go to concerts. And then the smell of the weed, it smells like a couch on fire that I smoked every day for 20 years, that I haven't smoked for 37 and hope not to gets to me, but mostly it's like I can't stand loud and it frightens me. And so, and Neal would love to have people over and go. This is so, he would love to go to people's houses. Now, I'd rather for dinner, and I would rather go to the dentist than to go to people's houses. We have a couple whose house we go to every Tuesday, and we bring them food. They're kind of shut-ins, and I love them and I look forward to it. I would rather go get my gums scraped at the periodontist than go to a cocktail party. You can ask him. I don't think I've ever gone to a party. I mean, I've gone to 2 or 3 parties in 7.5 years. If
When we got married, we had a party, right?
yeah, we did. We had a wedding. Yeah, if you count the wedding as a party, that's like 4. So anyway, but so you let the other person do and be what they need to do and be to feel alive and to feel safe. Safety is a really huge thing for me. I have a tiny office. It's 7 by 10. I like small, safe spaces. And Neal has a much more expansive thirst for life. Like I like cruise ships, and he just did 3 weeks in Tibet and China and Nepal and Mongolia. And he said, "Oh, do you want to come?" And I was like, "Look at this little face. This little face wants to go to Mongolia." So
I also like her life, right? So I can spend weeks in a row without going out. In the life that you kind of have molded. It's a good life.
yeah.
Well, I'm conscious of us needing to start to close out, and so I'm
Right. One thing, John,
yeah.
I was going to suggest, if you have 10 minutes, I was going to suggest that I go now because I'm hungry and tired. And, but that it would be, I think it would be so incredible for your listeners, for you and Neal to do the inner critic work that his book is about. I think it'd be really great. And I told both of you, you'd love the other one, right? And I was right. And I know you could talk for another hour, but if you both have the time, I think it would be really illuminating for your listeners. Yeah.
I'm in if you're in, Neal.
Gestalt thing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, John, I'm giving you a big hug and kiss, and to
Annie, hugs and kisses
Scott
to you.
too. Give her a hug and a kiss
I will.
for me. And
Thank
we'll
you.
see you again.
Absolutely, Annie. Good to see you. Thank you for being
Good
here.
to see you. Thank you, love.
Yeah.
See you, sweetie.
Thanks, Neal. I got to tell you, your book, and we'll just keep rolling if you're cool.
Sure.
I'm gonna take your book and I'll buy about a big stack of them. I'll keep them in my office to give them away to my clients and patients. I'm really excited. It was such an articulate dive, and anything that I read that I can so quickly apply to my own life is something that I want to share with other people. And so it's, I mean, well done, man, because you take people on a wonderful journey, and I'm a beneficiary of that, and other people are too, I guarantee.
I appreciate that. I stumbled into this stuff, and it's fun to articulate it, and it's fun to spend time with it. So at the centerpiece of the book is this one trippy exercise, which I'll do with you.
Cool.
And I'll set it up by asking a few questions, and then we'll do the exercise. The first question, and I do this, by the way, with every single one of my private clients, and also one of my, this to me is an essential beginning to getting that voice to start to disappear or move to the side or weaken or whatever metaphor you want. When you hear that voice of the inner critic, what sort of things does it say to you, and what words does it use against you?
Yeah, I mean, mine tends to be about worthiness. That I'm messed up. It tends to be about, both having made a mistake and I don't, it's not this isn't the voice about being a mistake, but it's like, I'm a fuck up, or I fucked up. And there's a lot of, self. And so let me hang on for a second. Let me kind of get in there.
That's good enough. No, you're in there far enough. And so it has two basic worlds that it operates in. One of them says you're not worthy, and the other one says you're unlovable. right?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
sometimes sounds like it's saying um, you haven't found love, but what it's really saying is you're unlovable and you're not worth enough, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the feedback that I tend to get about when I get feedback that I'm not I'm a risk taker actually, and I'm a total risk taker, and so I do a lot where I push, and yet also I think there are really meaningful risks that I probably don't take because I have that tape that can play, and that just unconsciously prevents me from embodying strengths that I have.
Yeah,
But
of
it
course.
tricks me and says I don't have those.
Yeah. When you hear the voice, does it have the inflections of anybody from your past?
You know, when I was reading your
But
book, I thought about this. It because you, of course, talked about the voice of the mother being a constant, and I don't experience it necessarily as any particular voice.
yeah,
I certainly experience the sensations, and I certainly experience the essence of it, and
yeah.
I can derive a meaning from it. But no, I don't. It's not like audible as far as
Okay. About 80% of people hear their mother's voice nagging, and the other 20% is mostly their father's voice,
mhm,
particularly if he was a strict disciplinarian. It's useful. It doesn't actually matter,
mhm,
and then the rest are spread between myself, an older sibling, a caretaker, a
mhm,
grandparent, all sorts of. It actually doesn't matter because all it needs is a voice of an authority,
mhm,
an
mhm,
authority,
mhm,
and the easiest one for it to find is usually a parent, but sometimes that's harder for it to find, so it'll find another voice.
mhm.
Um, where in your physical geography does the voice emanate from?
Most often it's my chest
Uh-huh.
and
Probably toward the front, right?
yeah, here. Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
most people, it's the back of the head, and then it can be the front of the um, chest or the front of the belly.
yeah.
Um, but everybody feels it close to the surface of the body, which is a
Mm,
nice clue that it's not actually unconscious. It's not actually a deep part of yourself, like your authentic self tends to feel like it's coming from the center of your meridian somewhere. Whereas this comes from the surface. And that's because it's actually just there as an externalizing mediator, right?
yeah. Well said.
It isn't an unconscious, the way I put it is Freud got it almost 100% right, except that he thought it was unconscious. It's actually subvocal,
But
right?
on that note, just because I love that you this quote from Freud that you brought about not the anxiety, it's not what we fear happening in the future, but we fear being punished. And I'm will you say that so because I'm getting it wrong, but
Yeah,
say it.
I know. I read, so in doing research for this, I read over and over again, just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. I probably read it four times, I think. Um, um, Freud's great work on the superego, which oddly enough is called the ego and the id, even though
Yeah.
it's really about his discovery of the superego. He already knew that about the ego and the id, but and he talks about that's where he develops the idea of a three-part unconscious self. That's the id is the two instincts, the libido um, and the survival instinct, and the superego is your ethical framework, your moral framework, your social framework. And then he has a third thing called an ego that he thought was mediating between the id and the superego. That's
Hmm.
probably not so true. They probably operate separately and distinctly and don't. But it's part of the bad seed myth is that you have these compulsions that are dangerous and
Yeah.
predatory and homicidal, and I doubt any of that's particularly true. But if it were true, you would need something to adjust between the moral social world and your own, not amorality, but the way he presents it, immorality, right?
Hmm.
So at any rate, those are the three parts. And the fourth time I read it, which probably the seventh or eighth time in my life that I read it, for the first time I saw this sentence, and it just lit up in neon. Anxiety is the fear of the punishment of the superego, which means
Ooh.
anxiety is the fear of a frown from an absent parent,
Oh,
because
yeah.
that's the only punishment that the superego can bring to bear, is a pretend frown from a pretend parent, which means that when I'm anxious, I'm not anxious about the actual possibility of a bad consequence in terms of what that consequence would be. I have plenty of bad consequences that I shrug at because I'm realistic and I realize, well, I took a risk there and it went sideways and big deal. I don't
Mhm.
feel anxious about it. The only ones that I feel anxious about are the ones where the superego has inflicted itself on me and has said,
Mhm.
I'm going to frown at you if you get this wrong. So as you move the inner critic to the side or out of the center or away from you, a nice benefit of that is that your anxiety drops. And in my case, it dropped substantially when I
Mhm.
started doing my superego work. Um, so let's keep going on the
Yeah, yeah,
exercise.
keep going.
So I want you to pull your superego out of your chest and hold it in front of you. Hold your face your palm to you. You do this exercise, eyes open. So stiff arm yourself, and your superego will, its face will appear in your palm, and tell me when you see its face.
Got it.
Okay, and what's its face? What's it look like right now?
Oh, it's a little gremlin demon monster is what it
Gremlin.
is.
Okay, we'll
Yeah,
call it your gremlin.
gremlin.
And what's its expression?
It's a menacing.
Yeah. Okay, so the expressions will range all the way from snark to anger,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that's it. You're never going to see a delighted expression on its face.
What
It's
a
never
dick.
going to turn into a nice, helpful friend of yours. It only has one way of being, which is to bully you. And so
Yeah.
bullies control and anger and passive aggression
Mhm.
are what we
Ooh.
go to when we're frustrated over lack of control, and they're
Mhm.
also what we go to when we try to control others. And so its interest is in control. I'm going to feed you some questions to ask it,
Okay.
and you ask the question aloud, and it will answer aloud. And I want you to, it will answer. I want you to repeat back so that I can hear it aloud, its answer too. So the first question is, when did you take charge? So ask
When
it aloud.
when did you take charge? That seems young to me. It says 5.
It said when you were 5.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Who put you in charge?
Who put you in charge? It says my mother.
Your mother. So
Hmm.
it says your mother. Okay.
Hmm.
Um,
Sorry, Mom.
I'd like to take charge. Is that okay?
I'd like to take charge. Is that okay? It said I'd love you to.
Okay. Why are you still in charge?
Why are you still in charge? This is shit that I'm like, this is typical stuff. It's like it said immediately, um, because you haven't come to know me yet.
Okay. How do you know I can't take charge?
How do you know I can't take charge? Because you keep doing the same shit.
Haven't you been in charge all that time?
Haven't you been in charge all that time? That was funny. It was just a funny face, like one of
Yeah.
those
They get stumped.
stumped. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
a stumped thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'd like to take charge for a while. Will you get out of the way so that I can take charge?
I'd like to take charge for a while. Will you get out of the way so I can take charge? Yeah, affirmative.
Okay. Are you worried something bad will happen to me if I take charge?
Are you worried something bad will happen to me if I take charge? I've considered it.
Okay. What are you worried might happen to me if I take charge?
What are you worried might happen to me if I take charge? It actually said I have no fucking clue.
Okay. Are you worried something bad will happen to you if I take charge?
That was a yes. I didn't even need to ask. Are you worried something bad will happen to you if I take charge? Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
It's very.
What are you worried will happen to you?
Well, it said non-existence. I mean,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I promise I won't annihilate you.
I promise I won't annihilate you.
Isn't it tiring running the show all the time?
Isn't it tiring running the show all the time? It's exhausting.
Yeah. How would you like to go into semi-retirement as my occasional ethical advisor?
How would you like to go into semi-retirement as my occasional ethical advisor? Agreed. I'd love to.
Okay. If I succeed in taking charge, you will have fulfilled your original charter, which was to turn me from a child to an adult.
So, yeah. Say that again.
Yeah, I'll do it in parts. If I succeed in taking charge,
If I succeed in taking charge,
you will have fulfilled your original charter,
you will have fulfilled your original charter,
which was to mature me from being a kid to being an adult.
which was to mature me from being a kid to being an adult.
And what does it look like?
Easy going, a lot
Okay.
lighter. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to thank you for saving my life when I was a kid.
And I want to thank you for saving my life when I was a kid.
And then let it back into your chest.
Thank you.
So yours is, you've done a lot of work, and so yours is already kind of primed to get out of the way as long as it's on survival. But it's true of all of them that by the time you're a full-fledged adult, which means over 17 years old, they're more concerned about their own survival than about your betterment. And they're really sticking around out of habit. And if you can get them to accept semi-retirement, they will eventually go into semi-retirement. It takes them a while because they just have a habit of running things, and they're just used to it, and so they stick around for a while. But it's a very weird thing that this two-dimensional facsimile of a being has a survival instinct. It just does, right?
Yeah.
And I suppose sometimes I think about studying whether, we want to keep mom and dad around, whether there's a Peter Pan aspect to it, that we're keeping them alive to a certain extent. But I don't really want to go there. You don't need to go there. The only homework I give people after introducing them to their inner critic is to listen for the inner critic's messaging during the day. And if you catch it talking to you and saying something nasty like, I can't believe you did that again, or nobody loves you, or God, what an asshole you are, or you're going to fail at this, any of those sorts of things, all of them, just to stop and go, wait a minute, that's you. And as soon as you say that's you, you've done a whole bunch of things. You've separated it from you. You've noticed that it's a bully. You've noticed that it only talks to you like you're 6 years old and you're not 6 years old or 5 years old or 7 years old. And that what it has to say is entirely irrelevant to your success, whatever it's talking about. It's simply unnecessary after you're 17 years old. You're more sophisticated than it. You are listening to the dumbest bully in the back of the class.
Yeah.
That's what you're doing all day long. And we're all doing it thinking somehow it's relevant. And it's completely irrelevant to our being. You're a perfectly moral person. You integrated all of those moral lessons through trial and error when you were kids, like a kid, like everybody else does. You're perfectly moral. Moral just means I know right from wrong. Well, that's all it's doing, is giving you really old, hackneyed right, wrong, good, bad kind of messaging, you already know that stuff. You know how to cross a street and look both ways, right? You've integrated full morality. Doesn't mean you're going to always do something that other people say is moral, but you know the difference between right and wrong, which also means that by and large, despite what it's saying, oh, you're going to get this wrong, this is going to go bad, you're going to make a bad choice here, you're actually, as you cruise through your day, you're making good versus good choices. You're not making good. It's only in retrospect that it says, see, I told you. No, all that's not a bad choice. People aren't making bad choices. They're making a perfectly good choice, a moral choice almost always. And one's got enough risk in it, or both have risk in them actually, but one's got enough risk in it that it may well go sideways. And if it goes sideways, you adapt to it. It wasn't a bad decision. It was a good decision. And you're perfectly good at adapting to it. You're not making fateful, consequential decisions during your day. If you were, you could use this voice warning you, right? But unless you have a rattlesnake appearing on the trail directly in front of you, a real survival threat, physical survival threat, then no decision you make is fateful.
Well,
They're all adjustable.
Yeah, I guess the thought comes up about plenty of folks I've worked with, which is that there are folks who are identified with the fact that that voice is a motivating factor, and it is, and so I've worked with so many people who are almost like a bit like Gollum, they're Gollum-y and protective with their like negativity and their shame because they imagine that they are productive, engaged, successful people because they've listened to that voice. What do you say to that?
So the idea that we're damaged and bad seed children is very helpful for the species to keep everybody obedient and productive, to move huge amounts of food and building and construction materials around the world to feed and house 8 billion people, and most of them in places that the human body isn't designed to live in and that don't have the surroundings to nourish them and protect them. And so we have a complicated civilized life living next door to strangers and being obedient to a set of productive rules that say you only matter insofar as you serve other people, pack animal kind of behavior, is good for the species and bad for the human psyche. If you can escape it, you'll still be productive. If you can escape it, you'll be free to spend part of your day enjoying life as it is without feeling like you're wasting time or wasting your life or not pitching in enough or any of those kind of hoary old messages that are just distributed everywhere we look, that I'm going to be a wastrel and I'm going to be useless and I'm actually might be evil or bad if I don't have something reminding me to be good. You just have to test it and see if, as it moves away, you don't find yourself to actually, I think in most cases, people discovered that they're actually, it's kind of like, a lot of people, when COVID hit and their lives became far less busy and less cluttered, not all people, but a lot of people discovered they liked themselves. And the inner critic doesn't want you to know that you like it yourself and that you have the opportunity to like yourself and you have the opportunity to forgive yourself everything in the past and to notice that anything that you think was deserving of forgiveness, you've already adapted and won't do it again, right? And if you do it again, maybe you have to do it 2 or 3 times before you get the message, but you're still moving in the right direction.
Would you give a pre and post of your, like, pre-writing this book and post-writing this book? How has that changed your understanding of yourself and how you interact, certainly with Annie, but with the world?
Pre-doing this work or pre-writing this book?
Pre-writing the book.
I just encountered the exact same sorts of things I thought I would in terms of, well, you know, the main thing about the book is that the exercise I just did with you, I get to see and hear about more people doing that exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is somehow I think you're asking a different question.
Let me fill in the blank. So what I'm really getting at is that I think writing a book is a profound act of imagination. And with this subject matter, you're digging into places that are inherently the places that many don't travel. You know, you're moving into shadow and the buried places, and it's obvious that you've been doing this work with the diamond path and all kinds of so it may not be so obvious because you've been walking this journey for a long time, and so maybe to go back to what you assumed, which is pre-doing this work and post-doing this work. um, but I'm just imagining the book as an expression of a lot of interiority and introspection and confrontation with self.
That's that's funny. I don't think about it that way. I'm a writer. When I write a book, I'm looking at the sentences. I'm really not, I'm assuming I've done my research before I sit down and write it.
Wow.
And I'm really looking at, I'm writing, I always, whether I'm writing a business letter or a short story or this book or anything, I go in the exact same way. My job is to be articulate and to
Mm.
try to get difficult things across simply and to
Mm.
get people to enjoy themselves while they're reading it and to surprise them a little. But mainly, I'm interested in each sentence. And it's funny to write a book that's kind of a handbook or a self-help book or whatever, because I don't get the reward of like when I write fiction or something more kind of obviously literary. I don't get the reward of being told that I'm good at my craft, right? I get the reward
Mm.
of being told this had some meaning to me. And
Mm.
I'm like, oh, that's very nice. I'd love to hear you tell me how I thought it was really well written. I just noticed that about a couple of weeks ago. I noticed, darn, I really do have to get a novel out so that I can get that kind of reward from.
Purge. You need to purge it out, Yeah.
Yeah. But it's I get I get a kick out of um the biggest thing I get out of it is that people tell me that they've done it and that they and I want to hear the same thing over and over again in a very funny way. I want to hear, and I do hear, oh, I thought that was me,
Mm-hmm.
right? I thought that voice was me. And I'm
Yeah.
like, bingo, you got it. If that's all you got out of the book, you're well on your way. Because as long as you know it's not you, you're gonna at some point in your life, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, start paying attention to what it's saying as if it's an anomaly or a parasite or an unwelcome non-friend. And all of those are true of it. And I do like that being out in the world. I did a more esoteric book that I put out a couple of years ago, and that book, all I cared about, because of the material was so esoteric, all I cared about was that it like this book had something in it that I thought the world deserved to hear, but I also knew there wasn't much of an audience for it. And all I really wanted was for it to be on shelved at 300 libraries. If it was shelved at 300 libraries, it would stick around long enough for somebody at some point to to notice it and incorporate it into their method or whatever.
Uh-huh.
It's a very building block. It's like it's about these objects you can find inside yourself that are before the Jungians tell their story. What is the story made of? What's the
Mm.
alphabet of the story? And there's an alphabet of abstract nouns of value that we have in our bodies. It's not an alphabet. It's a what do you call it? A vocabulary, a limited, rudimentary vocabulary of meaning that we actually have access to inside. Um,
Okay. Yeah. I'm into that, man. I'm totally.
it's a funny book, but I just wanted that to be on 300, and that got out into the world at all is fine. This book, I'm more like, it's not that I mean, to a certain extent, I care about numbers, right? Because I'm a writer, and so you care about things, and you're told by
Right.
your publisher to care about things and all of that. But just hearing a kind of drumbeat of, wow, I thought that was me. Thank you for showing me that. That's cool.
Well, I'm a therapist, that's how I think. I'm thinking in terms of healing and transformation and what it can bring. And I know there are some approaches out there that engage in this work, but I told my wife actually, I was like, this is an inspirational book. I've not stumbled across a book that so articulately digs into the inner critic and takes you through the process too. Because usually you must have done this very well, because when books tend to go into, hey, let's workshop this idea, try this. I tend to go over that part. And I took the whole ride. I read your appendix. I did the whole thing, and I thought, wow, this must have caught me in an important way. So yes, it was
That
very.
makes a certain sense because this work really did emerge from my practice, right?
Yeah.
I had these three kind of mechanical things that I knew about that I had worked on in myself over a number of years, probably about 6 or 8 years between when I first did a little bit of superego work
Mm,
and then had my first clients. There was probably about a 8 or 9 year gap in there. So by the time I got to the clients and started to shift into this, um, I just started testing things
hmm
that had worked for me and ideas that had worked for me. And I did that. When did I start that? I had probably 150 or so clients before who I had worked through this with before I wrote the book.
Yeah.
And so it would make sense that because it came out of the clients and refining things through the clients and figuring out what's universal, what catches people, what works for people, all of that. And these are clients who I would see weekly, right? And for months and years in
hmm
some cases. And so I really had an idea that this is a collection of useful tools surrounded by ideas, but mainly it's useful tools.
Well, but you drop things like two things that stand out: how much you cherish being ordinary,
Yeah.
which deserves some bandwidth, and then also how this your purpose is to be as fascinated as you can with all of it.
Yeah. Well, as the superego departs, I'm allowed more and more time in the um, amoral world of true nature rather than the social world of the justice system. And if I'm allowed
Mm.
more and more time, this is what Jesus talked about when he said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, unto God that which is God. He's really saying, you're going to have to spend some time with the tax collectors and the justice system and the politics and the religious rituals and all of those are Caesar's world. And the rest of the time is yours. And that world doesn't have the constraints on it and is actually fascinating. And you might want to spend some time there. And it turns out if you spend the more time you spend without outside of the justice system kind of world, outside of Caesar's world, the more time you get used to not being defended and not having a position and not having to pick a side. And when you're not having a position and not picking a side and not doing those sorts of things, you get to be more intimate with the world. And intimacy and love are the same thing in this sense. I mean, love really just means me relating to the world directly without any defensive interference or anything blocking me. And yeah, I described that a little bit in the book. Books about that tend to be a little show-offy, and so I have to be a little careful how much I describe it, because it is a natural outgrowth of this kind of work, but it's also very strange to people to hear words like living without purpose or without value or without, what would it be like to be intimate with the world without having to have a stake in the world, right? What would it be like to have some part of the day where I'm in nature and not thinking about global warming and not thinking about Trump and not thinking about dying people and not thinking about war. And everybody tells me to spend all my time in that world. That's the real world and the only one that matters. And I'm supposed to be not bewildered by it, but I'm supposed to take sides. And every time I take a side, I know one thing happens: I lose empathy. You can't have justice and empathy in the room at the same time.
Yeah, go into that, because I think, my wife and I both read the same book of yours, and I think we both like circled and starred this one paragraph. We were talking about social justice, the dynamics of polarity, polarization, and the us-them mentality. And so I'm glad you brought that back up, because I'd love to just open that up for you to free associate about.
Look, I have to spend a certain amount of time as a social being within the institutions of the nation and the town and the state and the culture and the religions, and making my choices of who to vote for. And I vote and I march. I have the same politics, more or less, that my parents did. And I vote the same way I always have. That hasn't changed. But I vote without very much, and I watch the news without very much indignation. I don't have any great belief that my vote or my position can be shown to have any long-term knowable consequence. Not because I'm trivial, but because knowable consequences aren't there in the long term. We have no idea what the species is doing running the show. They're running the show, right? The species is running the show kind of dumbly, as far as Darwin probably got it exactly right, dumbly just trying to add numbers in more niches. And fascism is an experiment, and democracy is an experiment, and our kind of rights-oriented democracy is an experiment, and other more compassionate democracies are an experiment. And I don't know which experiment is actually reducing poverty, reducing war, reducing friction, reducing disease more than what other experiments in the long run. I really don't. I do know that that's what the species is doing, right? I know that it's reducing poverty, reducing starvation, reducing disease, reducing war. At the same time, it's creating global warming and may create for itself the consequence of a premature collapse of population. I have no idea whether it will be able to overcome that, right? Species sometimes overcome those things, species sometimes don't. We're a strange species because we create our own mutations, right? All of that's going on way, way outside of my sight when I'm making my political choices and when I'm making my choices about what's meaningful to me and what's meaningful to the world. I know that I have a self that is available to me, that is connected and available to true nature. And true nature doesn't have human constraints on it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? True nature is amoral. And yet true nature is just, the reason why a walk in the woods is so beautiful is that we recognize how enjoyable it is to be connected without any kind of prejudgment with things around us. There's an underlying kind of noticing that if I can work on my defensive structures and reduce them to the least I can, get them down as interfering in my life as little as possible, that I do become more intimate with the people around me. Intimacy just feels good, whether it's in nature or whether it's with the cashier at the grocery store, right? If I can notice that the main thing we can get out of our encounter is joining in a particular form of love that will kind of arise between us, and that maybe this encounter isn't really about my exchanging money for food with the cashier. Maybe it's not about the efficiency of her moving people through the line. Then I don't have to really worry ever again about my purpose. Because I'm going to just naturally be generous and kind. That's what people are when they're not prejudging each other, when they're not deciding to use people for a particular value or use them or see themselves as having particular use value. I have no idea what my use value is, right? I don't want to know what my use value is. When I tell my clients, if I start thinking I'm helping you, I'm fucked, because then I'm going to diagnose you. And as soon as I diagnose you, I'm going to think there's something wrong with you, and I'm going to project myself on you. And even if I somehow hit it right, I'm going to be aiming things at you. And if I'm aiming or projecting or diagnosing, I'm way off of who you are.
So what's the assumption?
The assumption is that you're like everybody else. You're kind of a goofy, curious, kind and generous, strong-willed, not willful, steadfast. You're alive, right? And you're an adult. That means you've won, right? You've already won. You've already made it. That's all that you were supposed to do. You have 4 needs. You have food, shelter, clothing, and physical safety. And if you're talking to me on Zoom, I can promise you all those 4 have been fulfilled for you.
Well, there's something else though that's interesting that is like, as you were talking about diagnostics, I was thinking like, I say this to a lot of therapists, because I have therapists in the practice that I consult with, like I don't supervise them, because I don't presume to be more effective, but we do bump stuff around and try to bump up against each other and try to shake out what prevents us or what obstacles are presented.
Yeah.
But there is something fascinating, and just saying this very clearly, in all of my training as a therapist, trained in all kinds of paradigms. I mean, I'm a trained hypnotherapist. I've been trained in DBT and ACT, and got a doctorate in Jungian theory. I mean, I've got all kinds of different tools in the toolbox. But out of all of them, there's one change agent, and the change agent is the relationship. And I take that to be love, to be to meet, to lovingly, part of Jung said this, like, sure, learn technique and learn theory, but if you don't love the people you're working with, you need to refer them, and you
Yeah.
need to find something that you can love, and that your humility there is lovable. Like, trust is built between two people by you approaching me and with the attitude you're approaching me.
So to me, and I say it in the book, somebody once said this to me, and it changed all my ideas about love. Like, compassion is the love that arises in the presence of suffering. So if people come to me, they're coming to me because they think they have to get rid of some kind of suffering, right? And that's why people go to therapists too. Occasionally they come to optimize their life, but mostly they don't come for positive psychology. They come to
Mm-hmm.
they come to correct something or get out of some kind of suffering. Well, the one way out of suffering that everybody knows works is through it, right?
Yeah.
And that's why everybody complains. You complain to get rid of the complaint, right? It works, right? Venting works. It gets you to feel better, right? And as long as you learn clever venting, you won't even annoy people. Clever venting is telling jokes about the absurdity of the difficulty of life.
Yeah.
But you're still complaining, right?
Mhm.
Larry David is complaining all the way through and having a ball doing it, right?
Yeah.
And we're all complaining all the time. And so we know that. So that to me is just kind of the backdrop for any meeting that I have with anybody on Zoom, whether they're a client or anybody, is they're generally going to come to me with some form of suffering. And compassion is the love that rises in the presence of suffering, which means all I'm supposed to do is encourage them to talk and to suffer and to feel their suffering. That's all I'm supposed to do. And that if I'm doing that, compassion works, right? But see, the love was already there. I'm not even encouraging it. I'm not being compassionate in any way. I'm not acting compassionately. All I'm doing is let the person suffer, let the person complain, and the compassion is the form that the love takes because love just takes on the form that's appropriate if you get out of the way for being there. So if I keep myself from presenting a defensive posture to the grocery clerk, right? The grocery cashier, I'm allowing in the love that arises in the presence of a stranger, which is called universal love, or I think it's called universal, right? And it's got a certain flavor to it. And it's safe. I'm not going to jump her bones because I'm in love with her for those 20 seconds or 30 seconds. And it takes care of all of that kind of stuff. And I can just go from person to person undefended. And if they're coming to me with suffering, the only thing to do 99% of the time is just say, tell me more.
You said a word. I know we got to finish in a bit, but you said a word there that I have to be a researcher and ask you for your understanding. Defensiveness. How do you understand defensiveness?
Well, it's my superego coming in and presenting me with a personality structure that it's built up and maintained over the years that says I'm not allowed to show my true self. I can only show my shiny self. And it's this creaky superstructure that constantly has to be repaired and added to and all of that. And it's basically how most people live 100% of the day.
Yeah.
Right. And it's weird that it's completely unnecessary, that it's not actually protecting me. It happens, we have it because we live next door to strangers. We don't live in small pods of tribal people who can trust everybody in the little
Mhm.
pod, right? We haven't lived that way. Very few people have lived that way for the last 10,000 years. We've lived next door to strangers. And so we distrust people. And so we walk up to people thinking that we have to prove ourselves and they have to prove themselves. And so, yeah, this is Duncan Trussell's You Meet My Bodyguard.
Great.
It's a very elaborate, very well maintained structure. And it takes hard work to dismantle. Most of the work for dismantling the structure of the personality is, oh, that's you, superego. Get out of here. Mostly it's curated, probably 100%. I can't prove it. It's simply curated and maintained by the voice of the inner critic. And if my experience is, if you can get the voice of the inner critic out, people's defensive structures tend to melt or collapse eventually. And then you can just be intimate with anybody. You're not, people just aren't very scary. And you'll still, I mean, I still know how not to get mugged, just about any city except New York. I get mugged there occasionally. That's a hard city not to get mugged in. But I still can protect myself from real danger. I'm just not particularly threatened by everyday people. And I don't really think they can hurt me. And even if they hurt my feelings, it's not a big deal. And so I don't have to protect myself from that even.
Well, Neal, I guess thank you for this. Your book, again, like I said, I'm going to recommend it to all the folks in our practice, and I think it's just it's well written. Let me give you a compliment where it lands. You wrote an exceptional book, man. Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed talking to you. You're very open-ended and you're a very open person. It's
I
really
enjoy you too. Annie was right though. She did mention when I first talked to her, she was like, you got to talk to Neal. You got to talk to Neal. So it's really good to be with you today, man. Thank you for the time.
You too.
Controls your dreams, persuade